1942, during World War II, the US Navy plans an attack on Japan as retaliation for the Pearl Harbor bombing. On January 16th, a crew of 3, pilot Harold Dixon, bombardier Tony Pastula, and radioman Gene Aldrich, is on a patrol mission when they lose contact with their group. Dixon suggests returning to the carrier, but Gene says they are running low on fuel. To conserve fuel, Tony drops their bombs into the sea, but it doesn't help much. Without options, Dixon decides to attempt an emergency landing before the fuel runs out completely. Dixon successfully lands the plane on the water and exits with a life jacket, pulling a life raft behind him. However, Tony and Gene struggle to escape their seats and almost drown in the process. They manage to free themselves at the last moment, but don't have time to grab supplies before the plane sinks. After much effort, the men manage to inflate the raft. With no supplies and no way to call for help, they settle in to wait for rescue. The following morning, they spot an aircraft flying nearby and wave their shirts, shouting as loudly as they can. Unfortunately, the plane doesn't come close enough to see them and soon flies away. Dixon explains that it was their only chance. The plane was on a box search and wouldn't deviate from its route since the war takes priority over rescuing 3 men. They check their pockets for supplies, but find only a few random items, including a knife, some wires, and an empty water bag. Days pass as the men struggle to maintain their sanity. To keep themselves entertained, they chat about various topics, sometimes even singing together. During the day, the scorching sun forces them to remove more clothing, leading to blisters and burns on their exposed skin. At night, the temperature drops and they shiver in the cold. They take turns staying awake to watch for planes or islands. During one of his watches, Dixon urinates in his shoe and drinks it to ease his unbearable thirst. The next morning, the heat becomes unbearable, and Gene decides to jump into the water to cool off, wearing his life jacket for safety. Tony wants to follow, but Dixon warns them about sharks in the area, prompting Gene to hurry back onto the raft. As the days drag on, tensions among the men rise. Dixon's paranoia grows, and he repeatedly questions his crew about what went wrong on the plane, looking for someone to blame. Thirst becomes unbearable, and Tony considers drinking seawater, but is stopped by Dixon before he can make the fatal mistake. Dixon excitedly discovers a pencil in his pocket and uses it to draw a chart and track their direction, noting they need to keep the wind in their favor. They make a sea anchor using a life jacket, cord, and wire to prevent drifting the wrong way if the wind changes. Later that night, as rain begins to fall, they laugh in relief and collect as much water as possible using their shirts and the empty water bag. After a week of being lost at sea, Gene pulls out his knife and begins stabbing at the water. To everyone's surprise, he manages to kill a shark. They haul it onto the raft, cut it open, and eat the small fish found inside its stomach. They save the shark meat in their socks to use as bait later. However, their small victory has serious consequences. The blood from the shark attracts more sharks, and they now circle their raft, creating a constant threat. That night, Gene, feeling sleepy and distracted, accidentally dips his hand into the water and gets bitten by one of the sharks. Although he pulls it out in time to avoid losing his hand, the injury is severe. Dixon wraps Gene's wound to stop the bleeding. The next morning, Gene successfully shoots a bird nearby, and Dixon dives in to retrieve it. However, the blood from the bird draws a shark, forcing Dixon to swim back to the raft as fast as possible. He narrowly avoids the shark and manages to bring the bird back, which Dixon remarks tastes like chicken. On the 20th day, Dixon finally admits that he had fallen asleep for a couple of minutes while piloting the plane, causing them to miss their turn. He apologizes for the mistake, knowing he can never fully make amends. Despite the tension, Gene picks up the map, reminding everyone that it remains their only chance of finding their way back. A month into their ordeal, a powerful storm strikes. It brings heavy rain and lightning, along with massive waves that flip their raft over. The men lose their tools, but focus on rescuing the raft. Together, they manage to flip it back over and climb aboard and huddle together for warmth until the storm subsides. The next morning, the rain has stopped, but the men are too exhausted to do much. Just as despair threatens to consume them, Gene spots something green in the distance. It's an island. Overcome with emotion, the men cry tears of relief and begin rowing furiously with their hands. Despite their exhaustion, they push themselves forward, driven by the hope of survival. The ocean waves eventually carry them onto the beach, where they collapse onto the sand, safe at last. Spotting 2 shacks nearby, they muster their remaining strength and walk toward them on unsteady legs. Their landing occurs on February 20th, exactly 34 days after their ordeal began. They had drifted over 1,000 miles in their small raft. Following their rescue, Dixon is awarded the Navy Cross for leading his crew to safety, but he never flies another combat mission. Tony, unable to pursue his dream of a career in the Navy due to his injuries, eventually passes away in 1986. His ashes are scattered at sea in accordance with his wishes. Gene continues to serve as a radioman during the war, and in 1946, he fulfills a promise made during their ordeal by marrying Tony's sister.